We began not as a nation, but as a wilderness. First, a handful of explorers. Then, small bands of settlers fighting for survival on the edge of an uncharted continent. We grew, slowly and indiscriminately, into a patchwork of 13 British colonies. Total population, only 2.5 million people. It was the New World, like Europe, but yet very different. And as it grew, so did the desire to be free of European domination.
The year 1776.
Let Americans disdain to be the instruments of European greatness. Let the 13 states, bound together in a strict and indissoluble union, concur in erecting one great American system, superior to all European influences.
But even as the Americans renounce their allegiance to one European power, they are forced to seek the support of another. The Continental Congress sends an emissary to France. His assignment, to bring the French into the war against England. His name, Benjamin Franklin, the nation's first great diplomat. October 29th, 1776. Benjamin Franklin embarks for France. He is 70 years old. The ocean crossing will take over a month on a diet of salt beef and stale water. His target, the Great Palace at Versailles. The French king, Louis XVI, is a bitter enemy of the British, who defeated France in the 7 Years' War. He is secretly supplying the colonies with money and arms. Franklin's job is to bring his army and navy into the war as well. When Franklin arrives in Paris, several American agents already are there, but none share his fame. Frenchmen line the streets to see the great American scientist and writer. They even pay for places at the windows when his carriage passes by.
Figure to yourself an old man with gray hair, under a fur cap down on my forehead, almost to my spectacles. Think how this must appear among the powdered heads of Paris.
An admirer offers him lodgings at a nearby chateau. It is to be the first American embassy. Here the talk is often witty and gay, but the purpose deadly serious: to obtain more money, volunteers, and military supplies for the American cause. Late at night, Franklin writes his dispatches to Congress. Some are intercepted by the British. Others take 6 months to arrive.
The first phase of Franklin's mission is successful. He is a popular hero and the essential guest at every gathering of Parisian society.
He is the true man of the Enlightenment Voltaire has written about.
No. He is the simple philosopher admired by Rousseau.
Monsieur Franklin, we give you a crown of laurels to show our respect and admiration.
But popularity alone does not win revolutions. A year goes by, and the king still refuses to receive Franklin at Versailles.
We do not wish to risk war with England until we are sure the revolutionaries can succeed.
The French are biding their time.
At home, the war goes badly.
It is winter, and we have little shelter. There's no money to pay our soldiers. We're low on ammunition. In the spring, the enemy will be upon us.
I think we can consider it hardly possible that these quarrelsome colonies can cooperate in a war, much less a revolution.
We will not be defeated! We will attack!
October 17th, 1777. Today, at Saratoga, General Burgoyne surrendered an entire British army to General Gates. It's a great victory, and may be a turning point in the war. And let us pray it is.
Now, at last, King Louis agrees to receive Franklin and to recognize the independence of the United States of America.
His Majesty was most cordial and unceremonious. Firmly assure Congress of our friendship, said the king. I hope this will be for the good of the two nations.
February 6th, 1778. The Hotel de Lautrec in Paris. Franklin meets with the king's ministers to formally sign a treaty of alliance between the two nations against England.
On this august occasion, Monsieur Franklin appeared in a wrinkled old coat. Someone dared to ask him why, and he said it was the very coat he had worn before the British Privy Council 4 years before, when they had abused and humiliated him.
One result of the treaty is a French ship placed under the command of an American naval captain, John Paul Jones. Soon it is attacking British ships uncomfortably close to home. But even more crucial French support comes in the form of troops. For the next 3 years, French soldiers on American soil experience victory and defeat, agony and death, side by side with the American forces.
Their common struggle reaches a climax at Yorktown, Virginia. In 1781, a combined army under Washington and 2 French generals, Lafayette and Rochambeau, surrounds a British army encamped at Yorktown. A French fleet blockades the British by sea. The English try to blast their way through the blockade, but fail. The siege of Yorktown begins. The siege lasts 20 days before the sounds of battle fade into silence, and the last great conflict of the Revolution is ended. Cornwallis surrenders his entire army, a force of almost 7,000 men.
The road through which they marched was lined with spectators, French and American. The captive army approached, moving slowly in column, with grace and precision.
This very important and remarkable event has been celebrated by almost every town in the 13 United States.
Although it will take another 2 years to formally end the war, the outcome is no longer in doubt. When news of the Yorktown defeat reaches England, it throws the king into a rage and Parliament into an uproar. There has always been a faction against the war. Now they force the resignation of Prime Minister Lord North, and a new government is installed with a mandate to end the war. To negotiate the terms of peace, the government selects an obscure backbencher from the House of Commons, a successful merchant who has lived in America and has relatives and property there. Richard Oswald, a man they hope will prove congenial to Benjamin Franklin. The choice is fortunate. The two men quickly develop mutual respect and spend many hours walking the gardens of Franklin's chateau, discussing the terms of a settlement. Soon they are joined by John Adams and John Jay, who have been representing the colonies in Amsterdam and Madrid.
November 30th, 1782. The British and American negotiators meet on the left bank in Paris, where they sign the preliminary Treaty of Peace. The Americans have won a spectacular diplomatic victory. Although the British still control the territory west of the Alleghenies, the treaty establishes the Mississippi River as our western boundary, a boundary that guarantees the United States will one day become a continental power. Franklin and his colleagues have made a shrewd bargain. They know the British government is under pressure at home to protect loyal citizens still in the former colonies and to collect American debts to British merchants. They have traded these concessions for a Mississippi boundary. Of Benjamin Franklin and his colleagues, a modern historian has written, "The greatest victory in the annals of American diplomacy was won at the outset by Benjamin Franklin, John Jay, and John Adams." Apparently, the British negotiators agreed. According to legend, their embarrassment was so great, they refused to pose for the portrait commemorating what history has come to know as the Treaty of Paris.
(1789). The same year, George Washington is elected first president of the United States. The French Revolution sends shockwaves across Europe.
Men are born and remain free and equal in rights.
These rights are liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression.
The free communication of thought and opinion is one of the most precious rights of man.
Parisians storm the Bastille. The French monarchy collapses, ironically bankrupted by the American War of Independence. At first, Americans see their own revolutionary ideals reflected in the new republic emerging from the chaos in France. But as various factions fight for control, the spontaneous uprising is transformed into a reign of terror. Thousands upon thousands are marched to the guillotine in Paris, their heads hoisted on stakes and paraded through the streets. King Louis himself is condemned to death, and monarchs throughout Europe tremble with rage at this ultimate challenge to the divine right of kings. Soon, France is fighting most of the nations of Europe, and the wars of the French Revolution have begun. They will not finally end for over 20 years and will lead to a series of entanglements no American president can avoid. President Washington is determined to stay out of the European bloodshed. A split develops in his cabinet. Some are emotionally committed to the revolution and want to honor the Treaty of Alliance with France. Others argue the treaty was signed with the French monarchy and is no longer valid. Washington decides on a policy of neutrality, a policy always more easily announced than enforced.
The citizens unite! To freedom! To the sister republics of France and America, as incorporate as light and heat!
A new French minister from the revolutionary government arrives and receives a hero's welcome. But when he meets with Washington, he is sternly warned of American neutrality. He reacts with shock and anger and proceeds to openly flaunt Washington's proclamation, even scheming to have the president thrown out of office. In Philadelphia, political passions equal those in 1776. Extremists talk of dragging Washington into the streets to do him violence. The nation divides into pro-British and pro-French factions. John Jay is burned in effigy for negotiating a conciliatory treaty with England. Throughout the rest of Washington's presidency, the debate rages on. Only the force of Washington's personality holds the nation together.
1796, the end of Washington's second term. The president prepares to retire to Mount Vernon. His entire presidency has been marred by the vicious debate over the French alliance. He decides to offer some advice to his countrymen.
Why entangle our peace and prosperity in the toils of European ambition, rivalship, or caprice? It is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliances. We may safely trust to temporary alliances for extraordinary emergencies.
Washington's words were to become sacred in the conduct of foreign affairs, the basis of a doctrine of isolationism which would remain in force for over a century. Throughout our early history, trade was essential to the nation's survival. Independence brought with it an economic crisis. American ships no longer had special rights in British ports, and they fanned out over the seas in search of new customers. They could be seen in Rotterdam, in Naples, in the ports of South America, and even as far away as China. But the European war was a constant obstacle to free trade, as each side sought to destroy the enemy's supplies of food and raw materials from the New World. It was natural for the trade-hungry Americans to champion the rights of neutrals and freedom of the seas, but they were still too weak to enforce this policy.
Relations with France continued to deteriorate as actual naval combat became common between the two nations, a war no less real because it was undeclared. 1799. Napoleon Bonaparte seizes power in France. He orders a halt to attacks on American shipping and agrees to formally end the troublesome Treaty of Alliance. His dreams of conquest include the establishment of a French colonial empire in the New World. He sends a French army to subdue Santo Domingo, which he sees as a stepping stone to the North American continent. Next, he obtains the Louisiana Territory from Spain, and the United States is faced with the possibility of Napoleon's armies on the western frontier, in control of the Mississippi. To President Thomas Jefferson, this is an intolerable situation.
There is on the globe one single spot, the possessor of which is our natural and habitual enemy, New Orleans. The day that France takes possession of New Orleans, we must marry ourselves to the British fleet and nation.
Jefferson sends 2 negotiators to Paris with instructions to buy New Orleans from the French emperor. But in the meantime, the French expedition to Santo Domingo has met with disaster. the great rebel slave Toussaint Louverture has defeated Napoleon's army and killed one of his best generals. Toussaint has made an important contribution to American history.
(1803). Napoleon receives the American diplomats James Monroe and Robert Livingston at Malmaison, the Empress Josephine's chateau, and confronts them with a remarkable proposal. The disaster at Santo Domingo has caused Napoleon to abandon his dreams of colonial empire. He wants to regroup his forces and needs money. To the astonishment of Livingston and Monroe, he offers to sell them the entire Louisiana territory for $15 million. The Americans are not even sure that they have the right to accept, but they do without hesitation. And at one stroke of the pen, the territorial limits of the United States are doubled.
Within weeks of the purchase of Louisiana, naval warfare erupts again between France and England. The British announce a blockade of Europe, and Napoleon announces a counter-blockade of the British Isles. Once more, American shipping is the victim. President Jefferson now finds himself in the same situation as George Washington, caught between the competing and outrageous demands of the British and French.
The devil himself could not tell which government is the most wicked.
But in the end, it is the British who are the worst offenders. They adopt a policy of boarding American ships and seizing sailors for impressment in the Royal Navy. The British also are accused of paying hostile Indians for scalps of American settlers murdered in the Northwest Territory.
American history has been punctuated by great foreign policy debates in the halls of Congress. The debate of 1812 ranks among the greatest.
We'll drive the British from our continent. They'll no longer have an opportunity of intriguing with our Indian neighbors to tomahawk our women and children. The acquisition of Canada this year, as far as the neighborhood of Quebec, will be a mere matter of marching, a mere frontiersman frolic.
This is not a war for maritime rights, but a scuffle and scramble for plunder, urged on by agrarian cupidity.
Henry Clay, the leader of the pro-war faction.
Is the time never to arrive when we may manage our own affairs without fear of insulting His British Majesty? Is the rod of British power to be forever suspended over our heads?
In the end, the war hawks win, and a reluctant President Madison calls for a declaration of war. In many ways, it is not a glorious war. British troops invade Washington and burn its proud new buildings. As Americans view the results, there are bitter words. But adversity brings with it an unexpected benefit, a new sense of national unity. And there are great victories, particularly Andrew Jackson's spectacular rout of a British army attempting to invade New Orleans. But in fact, in the ancient Belgian city of Ghent, the war had officially ended 2 weeks before Andrew Jackson's great victory. Both sides had wearied of the struggle, and after months of negotiation, a treaty of peace is signed. The American negotiator, another of our great early diplomats, John Quincy Adams. The Treaty of Ghent puts an end to the last armed conflict between the United States and its former colonial master. And not until World War I is the United States forced again to go to war to protect the rights of neutrals and freedom of the seas.
During these years, Napoleon's dream of a European empire has collapsed in the Russian snows. Soon he is forced into exile, only to rise and fall again. The wars of the French Revolution are over. A Congress of triumphant monarchies assembles at Vienna. Their goal, to quench the spirit of revolution and re-establish the old order. Their leader, Prince Metternich of Austria, who wants not only to restore all kings to their thrones, but also to return to Spain her lost colonies in the New World.
During the time of Spain's defeat and occupation by France, her colonies in South America have overthrown their colonial masters and declared their own independence. Leaders such as Simón Bolívar vow they will never allow the Spanish armies to return. At the same time, Russian settlers have been moving down the west coast. Both the British and Americans see these colonies as a further threat to their New World interests, particularly when the Tsar issues a proclamation extending Russian claims south to the 51st parallel.
In London, British Foreign Minister Canning proposes a joint Anglo-American declaration, warning all Europe against any further colonization in the New World. President James Monroe calls a cabinet meeting at the White House to consider the offer. At first, Monroe is inclined to accept, recognizing that it will take the mighty British fleet to enforce such a warning. But Secretary of State Adams disagrees, proposing that the United States issue its own declaration.
It would be more candid, as well as more dignified, to avow our principles explicitly than to come in as a cockboat in the wake of the British man of war.
President Monroe accepts Adams' advice. He tells Adams to draft a statement for inclusion in his annual message to Congress. December 2nd, 1823. President Monroe's message to Congress runs 34 pages in his own hand, but only 7 of them are concerned with foreign policy. No one realizes they will add a new and fundamental principle to American foreign relations.
The American continents are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers. Any interference in the affairs of this hemisphere will be treated as unfriendly acts against the United States.
Many years will pass before Monroe's message takes its place with Washington's farewell address as a fundamental American doctrine. Old world rulers claim to be unimpressed by such impudence and challenge the doctrine more than once. Nevertheless, 40 years after the Revolution, the United States had at last established its independence from Europe. Washington and Monroe erected a barrier down the Atlantic, and now the nation was free to look westward, to the Pacific coast and beyond. For in this direction, there was no talk of isolationism. But that is another story.